I'll raise your children and you'll give me more. That's what the giant cowboy told the pregnant widow, right in the middle of town. Folks stopped breathing. A man that big don't ask for a family. He claims it. But what the town didn't see was a mother with no place to go, 2 little ones shivering at her side, and a debt that could drown them all. She wasn't looking for a husband, and he wasn't looking for love. Yet, with one sentence, he offered her everything. His ranch, his name, his protection. But out beyond the fence line, the railroad men are watching. They don't want his land. They want her water rights, and they'll burn every home to get them. When the dust rises and the sheriff turns his keys, this widow will have to decide. Is she just surviving? Or will she fight to build something bigger than her own name? Before we begin, drop a hello in the comments. Share your corner of the world and how you're feeling today. It's a beautiful thing to witness how stories can connect us across oceans, languages, and lives. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across dry Mesa's dusty main street as Eleanor Grace pulled her weathered wagon to a halt. The wooden wheels creaked in protest, matching the ache in her lower back. At 8 months along, every step felt like a battle, but she couldn't let her children see her falter. Not now. Not when they had nothing left but hope and determination. "Mama, I'm hungry," little Sarah whispered, clutching her rag doll close. Tommy, barely 6, stood beside his sister, his small hand resting protectively on Eleanor's skirts. "Just a little longer, darlings." Eleanor squared her shoulders, fighting back the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. The mercantile's weathered sign swayed gently in the breeze, promising supplies they desperately needed. The townsfolk didn't even try to hide their stares. Eleanor heard their whispers clearly enough as she made her way up the wooden sidewalk. That's the Grace widow. Heard they lost everything, 3 mouths to feed and another on the way. Eleanor lifted her chin higher, though her cheeks burned. The bell above the mercantile door chimed as she entered, the familiar scent of coffee beans and leather goods filling her nostrils. Mr. Peterson, the owner, looked up from his ledger, his round spectacles catching the late afternoon light. "Mrs. Grace," he said, his voice careful, measured. "What can I do for you?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "I need supplies, Mr. Peterson. Flour, beans, maybe some salt pork. I can pay." She faltered. "That is, I was hoping we might arrange credit. Just until—" "I'm sorry, Mrs. Grace." Peterson's eyes dropped to his ledger. "Your husband's debts are well known. I can't extend any more credit." The room swayed. Eleanor gripped the counter's edge, her knuckles white. "Please, I have children." "Then perhaps you should have thought about that before—" "I'll stand for her debt." The voice rumbled like distant thunder across the store. Eleanor turned, along with everyone else, to face the source. Silas Judd filled the doorway, his broad shoulders blocking the sunset. He stepped inside, boots striking solid against the wooden floor. Eleanor had seen him before, of course. Everyone knew Silas Judd, the rancher who kept to himself out past Cottonwood Creek. He was a mountain of a man, with hands like steel from years of working cattle and timber. "Mr. Judd," Peterson stammered, "this isn't—" "I'll raise your children," Silas said, his eyes fixed on Eleanor. "And you'll give me more." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a tide of anger and humiliation. Around them, the other customers stood frozen, drinking in the scandal. "How dare you!" Eleanor's voice shook with fury. "I am not some broodmare to be bargained for." Silas didn't flinch. His expression remained as unchanging as the mesa itself. "You need work. I need help running my ranch. The offer's honest enough." "Honest?" Eleanor spat the word. "You make such a proposal in public, humiliating me in front of the whole town. What kind of man—" "The kind who speaks plain." Silas cut in, his voice still maddeningly calm. "You'll have your own room. Lock on the door. Your children will have beds, food, schooling when they're ready. Nothing more required than honest work and keeping house." Eleanor's hands trembled as she gathered Sarah and Tommy close. And I suppose you expect me to believe you'll make no other demands? A shadow passed across Silas's face, something like pain, quickly masked. I gave my word to my late wife. It still stands. The mercantile had grown so quiet Eleanor could hear the tick of the clock on the wall. Every eye was upon them, measuring, judging. She thought of the night ahead, of her children shivering in the wagon as the desert cold crept in. But the memory of her late husband's promises rose up, bitter as gall. "I won't be beholden to any man again," Eleanor declared, her voice sharp as a whip crack. "Come along, children." She steered Sarah and Tommy toward the door, forcing Silas to step aside. His massive frame cast a shadow over them as they passed, and Eleanor felt something twist in her chest. Fear, perhaps, or something deeper she refused to name. The sun had nearly set now, painting the western sky in shades of fire. A chill wind whipped down the street, making Sarah shiver. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter, knowing it wouldn't be enough against the desert night. But she'd find a way. She had to. Behind her she heard the mercantile door open and close once more, followed by the heavy tread of boots moving in the opposite direction. She didn't look back. She couldn't. The pride that had sustained her this far wouldn't allow it, even as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The desert night wrapped its icy fingers around the abandoned livery stable, whistling through gaps in the weathered boards. Eleanor pulled her children closer, all three of them huddled beneath a single threadbare blanket she'd salvaged from their wagon. The musty hay provided little comfort against the hard-packed earth, but at least it offered some warmth. "Mama, my tummy hurts," Sarah whimpered, pressing closer. "Shh, try to sleep, dear one." Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair, fighting back tears. Tommy had already drifted off, his small body curled against her side like a kitten seeking warmth. A board creaked near the stable entrance. Eleanor stiffened, instinctively tightening her hold on her children. A massive shadow filled the doorway, and her heart nearly stopped until she recognized the broad-shouldered silhouette of Silas Judd. He moved quietly for such a large man, setting down a covered basket just within reach. Without a word, he turned and disappeared into the night, his footsteps fading away. Eleanor waited until she was certain he'd gone before investigating the basket. Inside, she found still warm biscuits, jerky, and a jar of preserved peaches. Her pride warred with her children's needs for only a moment before she gently shook Tommy awake. "Here, little ones, eat something before sleep." As she watched her children devour the simple meal, Eleanor's resolve began to crack. The baby within her kicked, as if offering its own opinion on their situation. Morning came too soon, painting the stable in strips of pale gold through the slats. Eleanor's back ached fiercely from the hard ground, and her decision was made before she fully opened her eyes. Pride wouldn't feed her children or shelter them from the coming winter. She found Silas already waiting by his wagon, as if he'd known she'd come. His expression remained neutral as she approached, Tommy clinging to her skirts and Sarah hanging back. "Your offer," Eleanor said, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "I accept, but with conditions." Silas nodded once, waiting. "This is temporary, just until I can find proper work. I won't be bound to you or anyone else." She lifted her chin. "And my children are my own to raise as I see fit." "Fair enough." His voice rumbled low, like distant summer thunder. "Wagon's ready when you are." Eleanor gathered their few belongings, while Silas loaded her old wagon's contents into his much sturdier one. The townsfolk began emerging from their homes and businesses, watching the scene unfold with undisguised curiosity. Eleanor ignored their stares, focusing instead on settling her children safely among the supplies. The journey started in awkward silence, with Eleanor perched as far from Silas as the wagon seat allowed. The children huddled in the back, casting nervous glances at the giant stranger who now controlled their fate. After an hour of travel, Silas pulled the wagon to a halt beside a creek. "Horses need water," he explained, helping Tommy and Sarah down. While Eleanor stretched her legs, Silas settled onto a fallen log and pulled out his pocket knife. With surprisingly delicate movements, his large hands began shaping a small piece of wood. Sarah, curiosity overtaking fear, crept closer to watch. By the time the horses had drunk their fill, Silas had carved a tiny horse, complete with flowing mane and tail. He held it out to Sarah without ceremony. "Might need something to play with," he said simply. Sarah accepted the gift with wide eyes, clutching it to her chest before running to show her brother. Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, watching this man's gentle interaction with her children. The rest of the journey passed more comfortably, though conversation remained sparse. The sun was setting when they crested a rise, revealing a ranch spread out below them. The house wasn't large, but it was well maintained, with a solid barn and corrals nearby. A windmill creaked slowly in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. "Home," Silas said simply, guiding the horses down the slope. Eleanor's room, when he showed it to her, was small but clean. True to his word, there was a sturdy lock on the door. A narrow bed filled one corner, with a chest of drawers and a small table beneath the window. The children's room connected to hers through a door that also had a lock. "Outhouse is out back," Silas explained, hovering in the doorway. "Pump in the kitchen works fine. I'll be in the barn if you need anything." He paused, then added, "Welcome home, Mrs. Grace." Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded before unpacking their meager belongings. The drawer held only 3 dresses, but she smoothed each one carefully before putting it away. Sarah arranged her new wooden horse on the windowsill, while Tommy explored every corner of their new space. Looking out the window at the vast, empty land surrounding them, Eleanor placed a protective hand over her swollen belly. This wasn't home. Not really. But for now, it would have to do. Eleanor woke to the distant sound of a rooster crowing. The unfamiliar ceiling above her bed took a moment to place, and then yesterday's events came rushing back. She pushed herself up slowly, her pregnant body protesting the movement, and peered out the window. Silas was already in the fields, his broad figure silhouetted against the rising sun as he worked with a hoe. The steady rhythm of his movements spoke of years of practice, each strike precise and purposeful. The kitchen proved to be well stocked, if simple. A pot of beans sat warming on the back of the iron stove, and a pan of cornbread waited nearby, both clearly prepared before dawn. Eleanor found herself surprised by this thoughtfulness, though she wasn't sure why. The man had already shown more kindness than she'd expected. Tommy and Sarah emerged from their room, rubbing sleep from their eyes. Eleanor settled them at the worn kitchen table just as Silas's heavy boots sounded on the porch. He ducked through the doorway, nodding a quiet good morning before washing his hands at the pump. "Thought we might sort out the day's work," he said, settling onto a bench across from them. His voice was low and careful, as if afraid of startling them. "Ranch needs tending, but you're welcome to manage the house as you see fit." Eleanor served the children before responding. "What needs doing?" "Garden could use weeding. Chickens need feeding. Wash needs doing when you've time." He paused, studying his coffee cup. "But nothing pressing. Take time to settle in first." The children finished their breakfast quickly, eager to explore their new home. Silas glanced at Eleanor, seeking permission before addressing them directly. "Want to learn about the chickens?" he asked, and both children's faces lit up. Eleanor watched from the kitchen window as Silas led Tommy and Sarah to the chicken coop. His massive frame moved with surprising gentleness as he showed them how to scatter feed, his deep voice carrying instructions about not startling the hens. Sarah squealed with delight when she found her first egg, and even Tommy, usually so reserved, grinned up at Silas with newfound admiration. As days passed, Eleanor began to notice patterns in their strange arrangement. Silas never entered the house after sunset, preferring to sleep in the barn's loft despite the cooling autumn nights. The parlor remained untouched, its door always closed, like a tomb holding secrets Eleanor dared not disturb. Until the rain came. It started as a gentle patter against the roof one afternoon, but soon grew into a steady downpour that forced everyone inside. Eleanor kept the children occupied with simple games while she tackled the dusty corners of their new home. In the back of a storage closet, her hands found a wooden box, its surface smooth from years of handling. She knew she shouldn't look, but something about the weight of it, the care with which it had been stored, drew her fingers to the lid. Inside, she found photographs, carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper. The first showed a younger Silas, his face softer somehow, standing beside a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Another revealed the same woman holding a small boy, no more than 2 years old. The joy in their faces made Eleanor's heart ache. "That's Martha and John." Eleanor startled at Silas's voice behind her. She hadn't heard him come in from the barn. "I'm sorry," she began, but he shook his head. "Water dispute 5 years back. Neighbor dammed up the creek during a dry spell. Martha took sick from bad water. John followed a week later." His words came out flat, as if he'd practiced telling this story until all the pain had been pressed out of it. Eleanor carefully returned the photographs to their box. "Is that why you sleep in the barn?" Silas looked away, his massive shoulders tense. "House feels too empty sometimes." That evening, after the children were asleep, Eleanor lit the parlor lamp. Its warm glow spilled out onto the porch where Silas sat mending a bridle. She left the door open, an invitation without words, before retiring to her room. Through her window, she watched him stare at that light for a long time. Finally, his figure rose and moved towards the house. The parlor door creaked, then closed softly. Eleanor smiled to herself, recognizing this small victory for what it was, a first step toward healing, for both of them. She lay awake for a while, listening to the occasional sound of movement from the parlor. The rain continued its gentle pattern on the roof, but now it felt less like loneliness and more like a lullaby, singing their broken little family to sleep. The weeks melted together like honey dripping from a spoon. Eleanor found herself settling into a rhythm at the Judd Ranch, her initial wariness softening into something closer to comfort. Each morning brought its own familiar pattern. Silas already in the fields before dawn, breakfast waiting warm on the stove, and the children's eager chatter filling the once silent house. Tommy and Sarah had taken to ranch life like ducklings to water. They trailed after Silas whenever he'd allow it, pestering him with endless questions about the cattle, the crops, and every tool in the barn. "Mr. Judd," they'd call out, the formal address carrying a warmth that made Eleanor's heart twist in unexpected ways. One crisp autumn morning, they hitched up the wagon for their monthly supply run to Dry Mesa. Eleanor sat beside Silas on the bench, her expanded belly making the fit a bit snug. The children bounced in the back, pointing out familiar landmarks along the dusty road. At the mercantile, Silas loaded their supplies while Eleanor selected fabric for winter clothes. The shopkeeper's wife, usually chatty, barely met her eyes. Eleanor felt the weight of sideways glances and whispered conversations falling silent as she passed. "Mrs. Grace, might I have a word?" Eleanor turned to find Preacher Walsh standing in the doorway, his weathered Bible tucked under one arm. His kind face carried a shadow of concern that made her stomach clench. "Of course, Preacher." She followed him onto the store's covered porch, away from prying ears. "There's been talk," he began carefully, "about your living arrangement with Mr. Judd. Some folks are concerned about appearances." Heat rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "We've done nothing improper. Silas sleeps in the parlor, and the children—" "I know, dear." The preacher's voice was gentle. "But not everyone understands. These are difficult times, and people can be quick to judge what they don't comprehend." Eleanor straightened her spine. "What they don't comprehend is survival, Preacher. Silas offered honest work and shelter when no one else would. I won't apologize for choosing my children's welfare over town gossip." Walsh nodded slowly. "You're a strong woman, Eleanor. Just be careful. There are forces at work bigger than local whispers." Before she could ask what he meant, Silas appeared with the loaded wagon. The ride home was quieter, Eleanor's mind churning over the preacher's words. The sun was low when they crested the last hill before the ranch. Silas pulled the horses up short, his body tensing beside her. Something's wrong. His voice was gravel rough as he handed her the reins. Stay here. Eleanor watched him stride toward the irrigation ditch that fed their crops. Even from the wagon, she could see the damage. Rocks piled high, blocking the water flow, with wooden stakes driven deep to hold them in place. This wasn't natural debris, this was deliberate. Railroad men, Silas growled when he returned. Been trying to buy me out for months. Guess they're done asking nice. Eleanor's hands tightened on the reins. This is our home now. We're not letting them drive us out. Silas glanced at her, surprise flickering across his features at the word our. He helped her down from the wagon, then spent the next hour clearing the ditch while Eleanor settled the children inside. Later, after Tommy and Sarah were asleep, Eleanor found Silas at the kitchen table, studying old property maps by lamplight. Your husband's water rights, he said without looking up. They connect to my south pasture. Together, our lands block the only practical route for their expansion. He traced the line with one calloused finger. That's why they want us gone. Eleanor leaned closer, studying the drawings. But my rights are worthless without land to use them on. Not if... Silas hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Not if our holdings were legally joined. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy as storm clouds. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered what he was suggesting. Not just a marriage of convenience anymore, but a strategic alliance against a common enemy. She looked around the kitchen. At the children's drawings now decorating the walls, at the herbs she'd dried hanging from the rafters, at the comfortable wear her presence had added to Silas's austere home. This place had become more than shelter. It had become sanctuary. How long do we have? She asked, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. Railroad's pushing to start construction before winter. They'll need the rights secured within the month. Silas finally met her eyes. I won't press you, Eleanor. We'll find another way if... No. She cut him off, surprising them both with her firmness. We'll fight. Together. Eleanor lay awake in her narrow bed, watching moonlight crawl across the wooden floorboards. The house creaked and settled around her, but her mind refused to quiet. Silas's words from earlier echoed in her thoughts. Their lands joined, their rights combined, their futures intertwined by law and necessity. She pressed a hand to her swollen belly, feeling the child within shift and turn. What kind of mother would she be if she let pride stand in the way of securing her children's future? But marriage, real marriage, meant more than signatures on paper. It was a covenant before God, a joining of souls as much as property. The first grey light of dawn was seeping through her window when Eleanor finally rose, her decision settled firm as bedrock in her heart. She dressed carefully, smoothing her hair and straightening her apron with trembling fingers. Silas was already in the barn, his broad shoulders hunched over the morning's milk pail. Eleanor cleared her throat softly, and he turned, his expression guarded. I've been thinking about what you said, Eleanor began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. About joining our holdings. Silas set down the pail, giving her his full attention. His silence invited her to continue. If we do this, if we marry, I need you to understand something. Eleanor lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. I won't have it be just paper and property. Marriage is sacred. It's a covenant before God and man. I won't mock that, not even to save our land. I wouldn't ask you to. Silas' voice was soft but firm. I've buried one wife, Eleanor. I know what marriage means. Then you understand what I'm saying. This would be real, not just for the railroad's sake, but for always? Silas nodded without hesitation. That's all I've wanted since you arrived. Didn't know how to say it proper is all. A weight lifted from Eleanor's shoulders, but before she could respond, Sarah's frightened voice cut through the morning air. "Mama, Tommy's sick!" Eleanor rushed to the house, Silas close behind. They found Tommy huddled in his bed, his face flushed with fever. His skin burned under Eleanor's palm, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. "He needs the doctor," Silas said, already reaching for his coat. "I'll ride to town." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight with worry. She sat beside Tommy's bed, pressing cool cloths to his forehead while Sarah hovered anxiously nearby. The morning crept by with agonizing slowness until finally, hoofbeats announced Silas's return with Dr. Matthews. The doctor examined Tommy thoroughly, his weathered face thoughtful. "Fever's high, but his lungs are clear. Could be the autumn ague going around." He mixed a powder into water, helping Tommy drink it slowly. "Keep him cool and quiet. I'll come back tomorrow to check on him." As Silas walked the doctor out, Eleanor heard their low voices on the porch. She couldn't make out the words, but when they returned, Dr. Matthews's kind eyes held understanding. "Mrs. Grace," he said gently, "I couldn't help but hear about your situation with the railroad. My own father lost his land to them 20 years ago." He paused, glancing between her and Silas. "If you're in need of a witness for any legal proceedings, I'd be honored to stand for you both." Eleanor felt color rise in her cheeks, but gratitude overwhelmed her embarrassment. "Thank you, Doctor. We haven't quite settled the details yet." "Sometimes," the doctor said, packing his bag, "the simplest solutions are the best ones, especially when they're founded on mutual respect." He tipped his hat to them both. "I'll return tomorrow for Tommy, and whatever else you might need." After he left, Eleanor and Silas stood in awkward silence until Tommy's weak voice called for water. They moved together to tend him, their actions falling into familiar harmony. That evening, after the children were asleep, they sat at the kitchen table, speaking in low voices. "The town's already talking," Silas said, running a thumb along the grain of the wooden table. "Dr. Matthews won't be the only one who knows what we're planning." Eleanor nodded. "Then we do it quietly. Just us, the doctor as witness, and Preacher Walsh to make it proper." She hesitated, then added, "If that suits you." "It does." Silas met her eyes across the table. "Eleanor, I know this ain't how you pictured things would go, but I want you to know I'll be a good husband to you, and a father to your children, if you'll let me." "I know you will." Eleanor reached across the table, letting her hand rest near his. "You already are." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, crickets chirping, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft creak of the house settling. It wasn't romance, Eleanor thought, but perhaps it was something better: understanding, respect, and a shared purpose, a foundation strong enough to build a life upon. Tommy's cough echoed from the bedroom, and they both rose, moving together to check on him. Their shoulders brushed as they passed through the doorway, and Eleanor felt a flutter of certainty in her chest. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Morning sunlight filtered through the lace curtains of Preacher Walsh's modest parlor, casting delicate shadows across the worn floorboards. Eleanor smoothed her best dress, freshly pressed but showing signs of wear, and watched as Sarah helped Tommy settle into a cushioned chair. Though still weak from fever, the boy had insisted on standing witness to his mother's wedding. The preacher's wife, Martha Walsh, bustled about arranging wild sunflowers in a clay vase, her efforts bringing warmth to the simple room. Dr. Matthews stood by the fireplace, his presence lending dignity to the quiet gathering. The mantel clock ticked steadily, marking time until the ceremony would begin. Silas entered from the study where he'd been speaking with Preacher Walsh. He'd cleaned up proper, his usually wild beard trimmed neat, wearing a pressed shirt that stretched across his broad shoulders. His eyes found Eleanor's, and he nodded once, solemn but sure. "Are we ready to begin?" Preacher Walsh asked, his worn Bible in hand. When Eleanor and Silas stepped forward, he gestured for them to join hands. Eleanor's fingers trembled slightly as they met Silas's calloused palm. His grip was gentle but firm, steadying her like he had that first day when she'd nearly fainted in the street. "Marriage," the preacher began, his voice warm and weathered as old leather, "is a sacred covenant before God. It ain't just about the joining of two people, but the building of a family, the strengthening of community, and the working of God's purpose through human hearts." Tommy coughed softly, and Eleanor resisted the urge to go to him. Sarah patted her brother's back, just as she'd seen her mother do. The moment caught in Eleanor's throat, her children already learning to care for each other, to be strong. "Silas," the preacher continued, "do you take Eleanor to be your lawful wife, to protect and provide, to honor and cherish, until death parts you?" "I do." Silas' voice was quiet, but carried the weight of mountains. "Eleanor, do you take Silas to be your lawful husband, to support and respect, to honor and cherish, until death parts you?" Eleanor swallowed hard, thinking of all that had led to this moment: the loss of her first husband, the desperate journey to Dry Mesa, the unexpected shelter she'd found with this quiet giant of a man. "I do." Silas reached into his vest pocket, drawing out a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," he said softly, for Eleanor's ears alone. "She'd want you to have it." The ring slid onto Eleanor's finger, worn smooth by years of love and work. It fit as if it had been made for her hand. "By the authority vested in me," Preacher Walsh declared, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss. Neither of them were ready for such intimacy. But Silas squeezed Eleanor's hand gently before letting go. Dr. Matthews stepped forward to sign the marriage certificate as witness, making their union legal and binding. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Tommy dozing against his sister in the wagon bed, while Eleanor and Silas sat side by side on the bench. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and a cool breeze carried the promise of evening. At home, Eleanor helped the children inside, while Silas tended to the horses. She was preparing supper when she heard an unfamiliar sound from the barn, the steady rhythm of a saw through wood. Curious, she stepped out to investigate. Silas sat surrounded by fresh-cut pine, his hands moving with careful precision as he shaped what was clearly becoming a cradle. Shavings curled around his boots, and the sweet scent of fresh-cut wood filled the air. He looked up when Eleanor appeared in the doorway but didn't stop his work. "Figured the little one would need a proper place to sleep," he said simply, running his hand along a smooth carved rail. Eleanor touched her swollen belly, moved by this tangible sign of his commitment. "Thank you," she whispered, then turned back to her supper preparations, blinking away unexpected tears. That evening, they sat down to their first meal as husband and wife. The table was set with Eleanor's mother's china, saved from the creditors by being too chipped to sell. Tommy was feeling stronger, managing to eat a full bowl of stew. Sarah chatted about helping Mrs. Walsh arrange the flowers, while Silas listened with the same quiet attention he gave to everything. It wasn't the romantic wedding supper Eleanor had once dreamed of as a girl, but there was something profound in its simplicity. She looked at Silas across the table, her husband now by law and choice, and saw not a stranger who had made an outrageous proposal, but a partner, someone who understood that love could grow from respect, that family was built day by day through small acts of care. They might not share a marriage bed yet, might still be learning each other's ways, but they shared something just as important, a determination to protect their land, their children, and the future they could build together. The morning sun painted the kitchen in warm stripes as Eleanor kneaded bread dough, pausing now and then to check on Tommy. His fever had finally broken 2 days ago, and color had returned to his cheeks. Through the window, she watched Sarah helping Silas mark out rows for the kitchen garden, the little girl's laughter carrying across the yard. Eleanor's hands worked the dough with practiced motions, but her mind wandered to the changes of the past week. The wedding band on her finger still felt strange, yet there was comfort in its presence. Silas had proven himself a man of his word, treating her children with gentle patience and giving her the space she needed to adjust to their arrangement. "Mama, look!" Tommy called from his chair by the window. "Mr. Judd's teaching Sarah about the corn." Indeed, Silas was crouched beside Sarah, showing her how to measure the proper distance between seedlings. He'd cleared a generous plot of land near the house, turning the soil until it was rich and dark. "A woman needs her own garden," he'd said simply when Eleanor questioned his choice of location. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Eleanor's attention. A sleek bay horse carried a well-dressed man into the yard, his city clothes marking him as an outsider. Silas straightened slowly, positioning himself between Sarah and the stranger. "Mr. Judd." The man's voice carried a practiced smoothness. "I represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." He produced a leather document case. "I'm here regarding some irregularities in water rights claims." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped onto the porch, her heart hammering. Tommy pressed against her skirts, sensing her tension. "These papers," the man continued, "indicate that the previous owner of the adjacent property, one James Grace, defaulted on his water rights payments." His eyes fixed on Eleanor. "As his widow, you're named in the proceedings." "That's not possible," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "James kept careful records." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nevertheless, the documentation is quite clear. The railroad has legal claim to those water rights now." Silas moved forward, his shadow falling across the man's horse. "Show me these papers." The enforcer handed over a thick envelope, watching as Silas examined the contents. Eleanor descended the porch steps, leaving Tommy in the doorway. The documents looked official, stamped with impressive seals, but something felt wrong. "These dates don't align," Silas said quietly, pointing to a line of text. The default claims dated before James Grace's death. The enforcer shrugged. "Clerical oversight, perhaps. Easily amended." His tone hardened. "Of course, if you're willing to sell, we could resolve this matter quickly. The railroad offers fair compensation." "And if we refuse?" Eleanor asked. "Then we'll be forced to pursue all legal avenues." The man's gaze swept over the farm, lingering on the children. "It would be a shame to see this dispute drag through the courts, especially given the unusual circumstances of your recent marriage." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. They'd known the marriage might raise questions, but to have it wielded as a weapon so soon. Silas stepped closer to the enforcer, his voice low, but carrying the weight of steel. "I filed guardianship papers for Eleanor's children the day after our wedding. Judge Matthews signed them himself." He handed the documents back. "You tell your railroad masters, this land stays in the family." The enforcer's composure cracked slightly. He clearly hadn't expected Silas to have secured legal protection for the children so quickly. "Consider carefully, Mr. Judd. The railroad doesn't take kindly to obstruction." "Neither do I," Silas replied. They watched the enforcer ride away, dust rising behind his horse. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gathered Sarah close. "You filed for guardianship?" Silas nodded. "Seemed proper. Children need protection." He looked down at Sarah, then over at Tommy. "They're family now." Eleanor touched his arm, a gesture of gratitude she couldn't quite voice. "The railroad won't stop." "No," Silas agreed, "but neither will we." He turned toward the garden plot. "Best get these seeds in the ground. Time waits for no man, railroad or otherwise." Sarah tugged at Eleanor's skirt. "Can I help more with the planting, Mama?" Eleanor managed a smile, drawing strength from her daughter's innocence. "Of course, dear. We all help each other now." They spent the afternoon working the soil, Tommy watching from his chair on the porch, calling out encouragement to his sister. Silas showed Eleanor how he'd planned the rows to catch the morning sun, leaving space for herbs near the kitchen door. It was practical, thoughtful, like everything he did. As the sun began to set, Eleanor looked at their day's work. Neat rows of turned earth waiting for seeds, marker stakes standing straight and true. The railroad's threat still loomed, but they'd faced this day together. Perhaps that was what marriage truly meant. Not passion or romance, but standing firm when storms gathered, protecting what mattered most. Sarah's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mr. Judd says the corn will grow taller than him. Is that true, Mama?" "We'll see, won't we?" Eleanor replied, catching Silas's quiet smile. "Together we'll watch it grow." The wagon creaked steadily along the rutted trail to the county seat, Eleanor and Silas sharing the wooden bench in an awkward silence. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie grass, and dust rose in their wake. Eleanor clutched the leather folder containing their marriage certificate and legal papers, her knuckles white against the worn material. "Reckon we should reach town by noon," Silas said, his deep voice barely carrying over the wagon's rhythmic sounds. "If the creek crossing stays clear." Eleanor nodded, adjusting her bonnet against the wind. "I appreciate you making this journey. I know the ranch needs tending." "Some things matter more than cattle," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor found herself studying his profile, noting the lines of worry etched around his eyes. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Your wife." Silas's hands tightened on the reins. For several long moments, only the creak of leather and wooden wheels filled the air. "Mary," he finally said, the name coming out like a prayer. "She loved wildflowers, used to fill every jar in the house with them come spring." Eleanor waited, letting him find his words. "Lost her and our boy to typhoid. Water dispute with the neighboring ranch." His jaw clenched. "They dammed up the creek, forced us to use the stagnant pond water. Doctor said that's what did it." "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, understanding now his fierce protection of water rights. "You're James," Silas said after a while. "What kind of man was he?" Eleanor smoothed her skirts, remembering. Kind, dreamed bigger than his means, though, always chasing the next opportunity. She sighed, left us with more debts than hopes. The wagon rolled on through the morning, their shared grief making the silence more companionable. By midday, the county seat's buildings rose before them, wooden structures trying to look important against the vast prairie sky. Inside the courthouse, the resistance began immediately. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, peered at their papers with obvious suspicion. "Marriage license seems hastily arranged," he said, glancing at Eleanor's condition. "And these guardianship claims are already filed and approved by Judge Matthews." A familiar voice interrupted. Preacher Walsh stepped from the shadows of the record room, his Bible tucked under one arm. "I took the liberty of submitting them last week." The clerk's face soured. "Preacher, I wasn't aware you had business here today." "The Lord's business takes me many places," Walsh replied mildly, but his eyes were steel. "These papers are in order. I witnessed both the marriage and the guardianship proceedings myself." Eleanor watched the clerk's internal struggle play across his face. Finally, he reached for his stamp, marking their documents with sharp, angry motions. "The railroad won't like this," he muttered. "The railroad ain't the law," Silas said quietly. Dark clouds gathered as they started their journey home, the air growing thick with approaching rain. Thunder rolled across the prairie just as Silas spotted an old line shack tucked against a rise. "We'd best wait it out," he said, guiding the horses toward shelter. The shack was rough but sound, with a small stone fireplace and enough dry wood stacked in the corner for a decent fire. Eleanor settled on a wooden crate while Silas tended to the horses and brought in their supplies. Rain began to drum against the roof, sealing them in their temporary refuge. In the flickering light of the lamp and small fire, Eleanor watched Silas move about the cramped space, his large frame somehow gentle in its motions. He offered her the last of their journey bread and a cup of coffee, then settled across from her. "I never thought I'd marry again," he said suddenly, staring into the flames. "After Mary. Seemed like that part of life was done." Eleanor wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "I never thought I'd find myself starting over like this, depending on the kindness of—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Strangers," Silas offered, a hint of hurt in his voice. "No," Eleanor said firmly. "Not strangers. Not anymore." She met his gaze. "You've shown more kindness to my children in these few weeks than most blood-kin would." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the small space. In that brief, bright moment, Eleanor saw something shift in Silas's expression, a softening around his eyes, a loosening of old pain. "Tell me about your boy," Eleanor said gently. "What was his name?" "Samuel," Silas answered, his voice rough. "He was just learning to walk when—" He stopped, swallowing hard. Then, slowly, he began to share memories of his son's first steps, Mary's laughter, the life they'd built and lost. Eleanor found herself sharing, too, stories of James's better days, of her children's births, of the hopes and fears that had brought her to Dry Mesa. The storm raged outside, but inside the line shack, something fragile and new was taking root, nurtured by shared understanding and the quiet comfort of truth spoken without judgment. Dark clouds still loomed overhead as Eleanor and Silas's wagon rolled into Dry Mesa 2 days later. The usually quiet main street buzzed with activity, and faces turned toward them as they passed. Eleanor's back stiffened at the scrutiny, one hand protectively cradling her swollen belly. "Something stirred up the hornet's nest," Silas muttered, pulling the team to a halt near the mercantile. Before they could climb down, Carlton Price emerged from the telegraph office, his suit pristine despite the dusty air. The railroad agent's thin smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached their wagon. "Mrs. Grace, or should I say Mrs. Judd?" Price called out, loud enough for everyone to hear. "How fortunate you've returned. We've just received word from the territorial court. There will be a public hearing next week regarding the legitimacy of your hasty arrangement." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. "Our marriage is legal and proper, Mr. Price. We have nothing to hide." "Indeed?" Price unfolded a paper from his vest pocket. "The timing seems rather convenient, considering your late husband's outstanding debts to the railroad. And your condition." He gestured vaguely at her belly. The growing crowd murmured. Eleanor felt the weight of their judgment, saw the sideways glances and whispered conversations. Beside her, Silas tensed, but she placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Help me down," she said quietly. Silas's strong hand steadied her as she descended from the wagon. Eleanor straightened her travel-worn dress and faced the townspeople gathered around the mercantile. Her heart hammered, but her voice rang clear in the afternoon air. "Good people of Dry Mesa," she began, "I know what this looks like to outside eyes. A widow with nothing, marrying a man of means just when the railroad comes calling." She paused, meeting the gazes of those nearest. "But I ask you, what mother wouldn't fight tooth and nail for her children's future? What honest person wouldn't stand against those who'd use the law to steal what rightfully belongs to others?" Old Man Peterson, who'd lost his south pasture to railroad expansion, nodded slowly. His wife dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Silas Judd offered me and my children shelter when we had none," Eleanor continued. "He showed kindness without expecting anything in return. Our marriage may have started from necessity, but it's built on respect, honor, and a shared belief in protecting what's right." "Pretty words," Price interrupted. "But the court will want more than— The court will hear testimony from me." Preacher Walsh's voice cut through the crowd as he made his way forward. The old minister's Bible was clutched firmly in his weathered hands. "I witnessed their vows before God and man. I've watched them build a life together these past weeks. Their union may not have started with romance, but I've married enough young folks blinded by passion to know that true marriage is about partnership, sacrifice, and choosing to face life's storms together. Several of the older ranchers moved to stand near Silas and Eleanor. Martha Peterson brought forth a basket of fresh bread and preserves. "Welcome home, Mrs. Judd," she said firmly, emphasizing the name. Price's smile had vanished. "This display of frontier sentiment won't change the legal proceedings. The hearing will show exactly what we are," Eleanor interrupted. "A family protecting our home and water rights that go back generations. Rights that shouldn't be stolen through legal trickery or corporate greed." More townspeople were nodding now. Tom Wesley, whose family had ranched the territory for 30 years, stepped forward. "My wife and I will testify to their character, if needed." Others murmured agreement. Price surveyed the shifting mood of the crowd, his jaw tight. "We'll see what the judge has to say about all this." He turned sharply and strode back toward the telegraph office. Eleanor's legs trembled with relief as the crowd began to disperse. Silas's steady presence at her back gave her strength, and Preacher Walsh's approving smile warmed her heart. "You did well," Silas said softly as he helped her back into the wagon. "Showed them what kind of woman you are." "What kind is that?" Eleanor asked, suddenly tired to her bones. "The kind worth standing beside," he answered simply, gathering the reins. As they drove toward home, Eleanor noticed something had changed. The looks from the townspeople were different now, respectful, understanding, even admiring. She wasn't just the desperate widow anymore. She had become something more, a woman willing to fight for her family, for justice, for the land itself. The tensions weren't over. She could feel that in her bones as surely as she felt her baby's movements. But for the first time since arriving in Dry Mesa, Eleanor felt truly seen for who she was. The road ahead would be hard, but they wouldn't walk it alone. Eleanor's feet ached as she climbed the steps to Martha Peterson's front porch. The morning sun cast long shadows across Dry Mesa's quiet streets. This was her third visit of the day, and she still had 4 more homes to reach before noon. Martha opened the door before Eleanor could knock. "I was hoping you'd come by," she said, ushering Eleanor into her tidy parlor. "Sit down before you wear yourself out completely." Eleanor sank gratefully into a cushioned chair, adjusting her shawl. "I appreciate your time, Mrs. Peterson. With the community meeting coming up, call me Martha, dear." The older woman poured tea into delicate cups. "And I know why you're here. The railroad's been pressing on all of us, one way or another." Back at the ranch, Silas worked under the hot sun, directing a group of local boys in repairing the damaged irrigation channels. Young Tommy Wesley and the Miller twins hauled rocks, while Silas showed them how to reinforce the ditch walls. "My pa says the railroad men are yellow-bellied snakes," Tommy declared, dropping another stone into place. Silas wiped sweat from his brow. "Best focus on the work, not the talk," he said quietly, but his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. By sunset, Eleanor had visited every prominent ranch wife in the valley. Martha Peterson had promised to bring her church circle. Sarah Miller offered her husband's support at the meeting. Even Mrs. Walsh, the preacher's wife, agreed to speak about the importance of protecting family lands. That night, as Eleanor and Silas sat at their kitchen table, the sound of approaching hooves broke the evening quiet. Silas's horse, Thunder, normally calm in his paddock, let out a shrill warning whinny. "Something's wrong," Silas said, grabbing his rifle. "Stay inside." But Eleanor was already at the window, peering into the darkness. "There are shadows moving by the north field," she whispered. A splash echoed through the night, followed by the sound of rushing water. Eleanor's heart jumped to her throat as she realized what was happening. "They're breaking the dam!" Silas burst through the door, firing a warning shot into the air. The sound cracked across the valley like thunder. Almost immediately, lights began appearing in neighboring homesteads. Eleanor grabbed the bell they used to signal fire emergencies and rang it furiously. Within minutes, horsemen appeared on the ridge. The Wesleys, the Millers, and other ranchers, drawn by the commotion. The railroad's men, caught in their act of sabotage, scattered into the darkness. But the damage was already done. Water from the compromised dam threatened to flood the newly planted fields. "Form a line!" Silas shouted. "We need sandbags!" The community worked through the night. Women brought coffee and food while men and boys hauled sand. Eleanor, despite her condition, organized the effort from the porch, directing supplies and coordinating teams. By dawn, they had contained the flood. The fields were damaged but not destroyed. More importantly, they had witnesses, dozens of them, to the railroad's underhanded tactics. Tom Wesley rode into town at first light to fetch Sheriff Cooper. The lawman arrived looking uncomfortable, his badge gleaming in the morning sun. "This can't go on, Sheriff," Eleanor said firmly, standing beside Silas on their porch. Behind them, the gathered ranchers and their wives nodded in agreement. "We need a proper hearing. The whole community needs to speak on this." The sheriff shifted his weight, looking at the assembled crowd. "Reckon you're right, Mrs. Judd. I'll set up a meeting at the town hall for next week. Railroad men included." "And their hired guns?" Silas asked quietly. "Won't be no weapons allowed," Sheriff Cooper assured them. "This'll be a peaceful gathering or none at all." As the sheriff rode away, Eleanor felt Silas's hand on her shoulder. The touch was gentle, supporting. Around them, their neighbors were already helping to assess the damage and plan repairs. Martha Peterson approached with a basket of fresh biscuits. "We'll need to organize for the meeting," she said. "Make sure every family has their say." Eleanor nodded, watching the community work together in the morning light. The railroad had meant to break them, but instead they'd forged something stronger, a unity born of shared struggle and frontier justice. "They don't understand," she said softly to Silas. "This isn't just about land or water rights anymore." "No," he agreed, his voice low and steady. "It's about standing together, about what's right." The sun climbed higher as the community continued their work, repairing what had been damaged, strengthening what had been weak. The railroad's nighttime raid had failed in more ways than one. Instead of destroying the Judd's land, it had planted something new, a determination that would grow stronger with each passing day. The church pews creaked under the weight of what seemed like every soul in Dry Mesa. Morning light filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worried faces. Eleanor sat beside Silas in the front row, her back straight despite her advancing pregnancy. The air hung heavy with tension and the lingering scent of yesterday's incense. Sheriff Cooper stood at the pulpit, his badge catching the light. "This meeting's called to address certain concerns about water rights and property claims," he announced, his voice echoing in the packed church. Carlton Price, the railroad's lead attorney, rose from his seat. His suit was crisp, his manner smooth as polished brass. Two other lawyers flanked him, their leather briefcases bulging with documents. "Ladies and gentlemen of Dry Mesa," Price began, pacing before the congregation. "We stand at the threshold of progress. The railroad brings prosperity, jobs, future." He paused, turning to face Silas and Eleanor. "But some would block this progress through questionable means." Eleanor felt Silas stiffen beside her. His large hands remained folded in his lap, but she could sense the tension in his shoulders. Price produced a stack of papers with a flourish. "We have evidence suggesting this marriage," he gestured toward them, "was arranged solely to combine water rights and prevent the railroad's legal acquisition of necessary passages." Murmurs rippled through the church. Eleanor's eldest son, sitting on her other side, pressed closer to her. "A widow, heavily with child, arrives in town," Price continued. "Within weeks, she enters into marriage with a man she barely knows. The timing, you must admit, is suspect." "There's nothing suspicious about Christian charity," Martha Peterson called from 3 rows back. Several women nodded in agreement. Price smiled thinly. "Charity is one thing. Marriage of convenience to thwart progress is another." He approached the sheriff. "We request these water rights be frozen pending investigation by the territorial court." Eleanor's heart pounded. They couldn't lose the water. not with planting season approaching. She started to rise, but Silas's gentle hand on her arm stopped her. Preacher Walsh stood slowly from his seat near the altar. His weathered Bible rested in his hands, along with a leather folder Eleanor hadn't noticed before. "If I may speak," the preacher said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the church. "There's been talk of timing and convenience. Perhaps we should examine all the facts." He opened the leather folder, removing several official-looking documents. "These are guardianship papers, filed by Silas Judd for Eleanor Grace's children. They're dated 2 weeks before their marriage." The railroad lawyers huddled together, whispering urgently. Price's smooth expression cracked slightly. "I filed them myself," Preacher Walsh continued. "Silas came to me, concerned for the children's welfare. He wanted legal protection for them established before any marriage took place." He handed the papers to Sheriff Cooper. "You'll find everything properly certified by the territorial court." Eleanor stared at Silas, who kept his eyes forward. She hadn't known about the guardianship papers. He'd taken steps to protect her children before she'd even agreed to marry him. "This proves nothing," Price protested, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. A man could file guardianship papers precisely to strengthen a fraudulent claim. "Or," Preacher Walsh said, "a man of faith could seek to protect innocent children before asking their mother for her hand, which seems more likely in Dry Mesa." More murmurs filled the church, but these held a different tone. Eleanor saw heads nodding, saw the way people looked at Silas with new respect. Sheriff Cooper studied the guardianship papers carefully. "These appear proper and legal," he said finally, "filed and certified before any marriage took place. The territorial court will still need to review the water rights claims," Price insisted. "This meeting has no legal authority to—" "This meeting," Sheriff Cooper cut in, "has the authority to determine if there's any basis for suspending water rights while awaiting that review." He looked around the church. "Based on these documents and the testimony heard, I see no cause for immediate action. The Judd's water rights remain valid pending territorial review." Relief swept through Eleanor like a cool breeze. They would have water for planting season. Time to fight whatever legal battles lay ahead. Price gathered his papers, his face tight with controlled anger. "This isn't over," he said quietly as he passed their pew. "The territorial court may see things differently." "Maybe so," Silas replied, his voice low and steady. "But they'll see all the facts, just like today." The meeting dispersed slowly, people stopping to shake Silas's hand or pat Eleanor's shoulder. Martha Peterson organized a group of women to bring dinner to the ranch that evening. Through it all, Eleanor kept glancing at Silas, seeing him in a new light. When the church had nearly emptied, she finally asked, "Why didn't you tell me about the guardianship papers?" Silas studied his hands for a moment. "Didn't want you thinking I was trying to pressure you. Needed to protect the young ones is all. Whether you agreed to marry me or not." Preacher Walsh approached them, his Bible and folder tucked under his arm. "The territorial court won't rule for several weeks," he said, "but truth has a way of prevailing." Eleanor nodded, her hand finding Silas's rough one. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not just as a couple, but as a family legally bound before God and man. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Judd ranch as Eleanor and Silas worked side by side in comfortable silence. Her pregnancy had advanced considerably, making some tasks challenging, but Silas always seemed to appear just when she needed help, without making her feel helpless. "Reckon we ought to reinforce that north fence before winter," Silas said, his voice gentle as he steadied a ladder while Eleanor hung laundry. "I noticed young Thomas Miller riding out that way earlier with fresh posts." Eleanor replied, smiling. The town's support had become a daily blessing, appearing in 100 small ways. That afternoon, Martha Peterson and 3 other women arrived with baskets of dried herbs and wisdom. They gathered around Eleanor in the kitchen, sharing generations of knowledge about childbirth and infant care. The scent of chamomile and yarrow filled the air as they taught her to blend traditional remedies. "My grandmother swore by this mixture," Martha explained, measuring dried leaves into small sachets. "Eases the waiting time, something wonderful." Silas watched from the doorway, a hint of tenderness in his eyes that Eleanor had grown to recognize. When she caught his gaze, he didn't look away as he once might have. The next morning brought unexpected visitors. Several ranchers appeared at sunrise, tools in hand, ready to help mend fences and clear irrigation channels. Their wives followed with food and supplies, turning the work into an impromptu gathering. "Ain't right for a family to stand alone," old Jim Tucker declared, hammering a fence post into place. "Especially not with a little one on the way." Near noon, the telegraph boy rode out from town, waving an envelope. Eleanor's heart jumped to her throat as Silas read the message aloud. The territorial court had upheld their marriage and water rights. The railroad's claims were dismissed. Relief washed over the gathered crowd. Martha hugged Eleanor carefully, mindful of her condition. Silas's hand found Eleanor's shoulder, steady and warm. As the celebration continued, Eleanor noticed young Billy Jenkins, who worked at the telegraph office, hovering nervously nearby. He pulled her aside, speaking in hushed tones. "Mom, I heard something at the office," he whispered. Railroad men talking when they thought no one was listening. They mentioned other ways of dealing with problems. He glanced around. "Just thought you ought to know they ain't taking this lying down." Eleanor thanked him quietly, watching as he mounted his horse and rode away. She looked at Silas, who was showing their son how to properly splice rope. Their victory felt both precious and fragile, like the first frost of winter. Beautiful, but bearing hints of storms to come. The autumn night wrapped around the Judd Ranch like a thick blanket. Eleanor paced the kitchen floor, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other steadying herself against the wooden table. Her labor pains had started just after sunset. "Silas!" she called out, her voice taut with discomfort. "I think it's time." Before Silas could respond, an orange glow flickered through the window. Flames licked up the side of the barn, casting demonic shadows across the yard. The dry wood crackled ominously in the night air. Silas stood frozen in the doorway, his massive frame tense with indecision. His eyes darted between his wife and the growing inferno that threatened their livelihood. "Go," Eleanor managed between breaths. "I can hold on." But before Silas could move, hoofbeats thundered in the darkness. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies as riders approached from town. Jim Tucker's voice boomed across the yard. "We got the fire. Take care of your wife." The community moved like a well-oiled machine. Men formed a bucket line from the well to the barn, while others beat at the flames with wet blankets. Women hurried into the house, led by Martha Peterson with her medical bag. Through her pain, Eleanor glimpsed the railroad's enforcer skulking away, but Sheriff Mills was faster, tackling the man into the dust. Inside the kitchen, Eleanor gripped Silas's calloused hand as Martha directed the birth. His presence anchored her through each contraction, his quiet strength never wavering. Outside, the sound of firefighting mingled with prayers and encouragement. Just as the fire died to embers, a baby's cry pierced the night. "A girl," Martha announced, wrapping the infant in clean linen. Preacher Walsh, who had arrived with the others, stepped forward to bless the child. "This little one," he declared, his voice thick with emotion, "is truly a child of Dry Mesa, born in fire, protected by unity, blessed by God's grace." Eleanor cradled her daughter, tears mixing with sweat on her cheeks. Silas knelt beside them, one large hand gently touching the baby's dark hair. Through the window, she could see their neighbors standing guard, a human fence stronger than any post and rail. The sheriff led the handcuffed enforcer past the window, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her world had narrowed to this moment, her newborn daughter, her husband's tender gaze, and the circle of protection their community had become. The late afternoon sun painted long shadows across the Judd Ranch yard. 6 weeks had passed since the night of fire and new life. Eleanor sat in her rocking chair on the freshly swept porch, her infant daughter Sarah nestled against her chest. Beside her, Silas occupied his own chair, the wood creaking softly beneath his weight. In the yard, Eleanor's older children played with the neighbor kids, their laughter mixing with the gentle clinking of wind chimes she'd hung last Sunday. Tommy, her eldest, showed the younger ones how to properly feed the chickens, just as Silas had taught him months ago. The irrigation ditches gleamed with fresh concrete work, a testament to 3 days of community labor. Men from all over Dry Mesa had come together, mixing cement and laying stone, transforming the vulnerable earthen channels into sturdy waterways that would last generations. Just that morning, word had arrived by telegram. The railroad had officially announced its new route, cutting wide around Dry Mesa's United Ranches. Eleanor smiled, remembering how those first harsh words from Silas had struck her that desperate day in town. "I'll raise your children and you'll give me more." What had seemed like an outrageous proposition, nearly cruel in its bluntness, had transformed into something profound. She watched Silas's weathered hands as he carved another wooden horse for the children, his fingers moving with gentle precision. The sound of wagon wheels announced evening visitors. Neighbors began arriving for the weekly supper gathering that had become tradition since Sarah's birth. Martha Peterson carried her famous apple pie, while Jim Tucker's boys hauled in fresh-caught fish. The ranch that had once stood lonely against the prairie now hummed with life and purpose. Lanterns were lit as dusk approached, casting warm pools of light across the yard. Silas turned to Eleanor, his eyes soft in the fading light. "What should we build next?" he asked, his voice carrying that same quiet thunder she'd first heard in town, but now wrapped in tenderness. Eleanor reached over and squeezed his hand. "A life worth the children we've been given," she replied, watching as their extended family of neighbors and friends spread out blankets for the evening meal. The lamplight glowed warm and welcoming as everyone gathered around, the sound of blessing and laughter rising up into the peaceful evening air. Thanks for being here. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, a truth, go ahead and subscribe. I'll be back tomorrow with another moment that just might speak to your soul.